Hundreds of multiplayer FPS games have been made over the years, but only a few franchises stick around and stay relevant. Call of Duty, Fortnite, and Counter-Strike all come to mind as games that seem to just stay on top, even with their temporary dips in popularity. But most games seem to only keep their popularity for a short time before they are abandoned by the majority of their player base, either due to a lack of content, a sequel title, or player distrust in developers' direction. Left with only a handful of extremely dedicated players, games like Titanfall 2, Splitgate, and Halo Infinite are good examples. While all these shooters play completely differently on a fundamental level, none of them would be here if it weren't for their inspiration from previous titles. In fact, earlier releases of some of these franchises, Titanfall, Counter-Strike, and Call of Duty, can trace some parts of their code back to the first 3D multiplayer FPS game to ever exist. A game that was so influential that Valve, the company behind the Steam platform, licensed its engine to create the original Half-Life game, which kicked off the company's launch and led to the creation of Counter-Strike and Team Fortress games. That game was id Software's 1996 title, Quake, and it took the gaming world by storm. Developed by id Software, the team behind the Doom and Wolfenstein franchises, Quake was id Software's first jump into a true 3D title, and they took what they had learned making 2.5D shooters and implemented it into the world's first 3D FPS. Quake caught on fast and focused mainly on its single-player experience and creative new ways of designing levels with verticality and physics-based enemies and projectiles. The Lovecraftian theme and the eerie music from the band Nine Inch Nails set it apart from Doom in mood and separated the vibe of the games completely. While Doom had metal music that made you feel strong and powerful like you were an action hero from an 80s film, Quake made you feel chills. It made you feel uncomfortable and like unnatural things were happening, which completely changed the way that you felt playing the game. The multiplayer was just as good and became the main attraction for the game amongst players. Deathmatch was the most popular mode amongst the majority of the player base, and Duel being the most influential, especially in later titles. Players quickly figured out bugs in the game that completely changed movement. Bunny hopping and air strafing were used to navigate maps faster and in unintended ways, and rocket jumps became a staple for vertical movement. Quake started to gain a competitive scene very early on. A player by the name of Thresh, who won the 1997 Red Annihilation tournament, is often cited as the one who popularized the use of the WASD keys for movement, the original purpose of which was to make it easier to reach the weapon buttons, which were organized mainly on the left side of the keyboard, as well as the use of mouse for aim, because before this, people had traditionally played completely on the keyboard, which means shooters and PC back in the day technically had the same aim time more or less as a controller on console. So if you play games with keyboard and mouse, well, you have Thresh to thank for the modern layout. Quake quickly became one of the first games to be called an esport, and its high skill ceiling made it very appealing for competitive gamers. All was going well. id Software had done it. They made the Doom franchise, which essentially spawned the FPS genre, and now Quake, which carried the torch through the next generation of gaming and became a huge success. But the id Software team was ready to move on and wanted to make something new. But as it turns out, it's hard to beat what many players had come to call perfection. Quake 2 was not originally going to be a Quake sequel, which is why the story is so disconnected from the first game. It sheds its Lovecraftian themes, opting for a science fiction one instead. The air strafing was removed and replaced with what would become the standard strafing in Quake. Some players disliked Quake 2 and felt rightfully so, that it wasn't really a Quake game in either the theme or movement. But Quake 2's influence over other games is still around to this day. In 1996, two ex-Microsoft employees visited id Software with a desire to make a game, but they wanted an engine to start with, and Quake had demonstrated that it was capable of fulfilling that role. Those two Microsoft employees were Mike Harrington and Gabe Newell, the founders of Valve, which is the company behind Half-Life and the Steam platform that most PC gamers know and love. After they gained the license to use the engine, they modified it to suit their needs and created Half-Life, which is arguably one of the most influential shooter games, in the single player space at least. You could tell there were elements of Quake still left in the Half-Life code as well, as air strafing and bunny hopping became mandatory for speedrunning. The modified version of this Quake engine became the Source engine, and some of the tech stayed on in other Source engine titles for a while before being mostly patched out. There was one more Quake game released before any competition threatened to take its player base. Sure, there had been other shooter games up until this point, but in the competitive space, Quake was king, and the game that seemed to confirm that the franchise wasn't going anywhere was Quake 3 Arena. Quake 3 Arena released in 1999 as the first multiplayer-only addition to the series. It leaned into the mechanics of Quake 2, creating a high-skill arena shooter that fans of the franchise loved, selling over 290,000 copies between North America and the UK alone. The graphics, gameplay, and weapons were improved over its predecessors, giving the game a next-gen feel compared to Quake 2. The backstory for the game was kept simple. The greatest warriors of all time are abducted and forced to fight for the amusement of a race called the Vadrigar. Many different skin options included characters from both the previous titles as well as the Doom series, linking the franchises together as well as providing a connection, as small as it was, to the universes of Quake and Quake 2. John Carmack, the co-founder of id Software and one of the main programmers behind Quake, has stated that his favorite version of Quake to work on was Quake 3 Arena. The multiplayer scene for this game included many tournaments over its nearly 10-year run, including QuakeCon, DreamHack, and the Esports World Cup. It also had ports to the Sega Dreamcast, which was cross-play compatible with PC and considered to be one of the best cross-play qualities that you could get at the time. id Software just couldn't be dethroned as the king of multiplayer shooters, only nearly matched by another arena shooter called Unreal Tournament, which had around 250,000 sales between the USA and the UK. Unreal Tournament, as a side note, ended up having its engine become the Unreal Engine, which most games today are actually built on. But only 1 year later, that would change completely, as Valve, who had been making their own games based on the Quake engine, acquired the rights to a Half-Life mod called Counter-Strike. Valve hired the original team behind the mod to help turn it into its own standalone game, focused on team play, slower, more tactical action, and no movement skills required other than walking. This made the barrier to entry much lower than Quake, which had very quickly become a highly competitive game with skilled players dominating lobbies, and often locking new players out of kills and score, which, when the point of the game is to get kills, was quite demotivating. In Counter-Strike, even new players had a sense that they were helping by either getting a single kill for the team or planting and defusing bombs. Weapons were also in loadouts instead of scattered around the map, meaning you started with equal footing to your opponents every single time. While the skill ceiling of Counter-Strike may not have matched that of Quake 3, it was still an incredibly competitive game with esports tournaments of its own. All of these aspects combined brought in over 700,000 players at launch, far surpassing that of Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament combined. This clearly showed that players were wanting something different from their shooter games than fast-paced, punishing gameplay, and the gaming industry could tell. While the 90s were dominated by boomer shooters like Doom, Quake, and Unreal Tournament, the 2000s signaled a massive shift in what players were looking for with shooters: slower and more tactical gameplay. Halo Combat Evolved from 2001 was one of the first games to bridge the gap between arena shooters and tactical shooters by having weapons that were in set positions on the map without the crazy fast movement mechanics of the previous half a decade of Quake games. Battlefield 1942 was released in 2002, amassing over 600,000 sales in the USA alone. In 2003, the first Call of Duty was released, and Counter-Strike Source in 2004. In 2005, id Software teamed up with an outside company called Ravensoft to develop a new Quake game focused on the single aspect player of Quake. Quake 4 was made as a sort of sequel to Quake 2, but flopped, leaving players with no true multiplayer sequel for nearly the entirety of the 2000s. In 2007, Team Fortress 2 was released by Valve with massive success, being a popular shooter to this day amongst multiple generations of players. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was also released that same year, and by 2008 had sold over 7 million copies. By the late 2000s, FPS games had completely shifted. You weren't practicing perfect map knowledge, you just needed to be familiar with maps. You were unlocking attachments, grinding ranks, or filling a team role. You didn't have to learn movement tech, you just had to queue up and play. But id Software was cooking up something behind the scenes. They weren't done with the Quake franchise just yet. Quake Live was originally announced in 2007 at QuakeCon under the name Quake Zero, a free browser-based version of Quake 3 Arena. And after being renamed Quake Live due to domain squatting, a practice of buying a domain with the copyrighted content of an existing company in hopes that the company buys it for overly high prices. Quake Live entered into open beta in early 2009, and the response was quite literally overwhelming. In just 6 hours after the open beta launch, more than 113,000 players signed up, flooding the servers and forcing id Software to add login queues to keep the system from crashing. It was proof that there was still a serious demand for multiplayer Quake. People still wanted that old school skill-based movement-heavy FPS. However, most of the FPS world still preferred the slower, more accessible shooters. That same year that Quake Live entered open beta, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 dropped, selling over 4.7 million copies in its first 24 hours. Halo 3 ODST also launched that same year and sold over 2.5 million copies in its first 2 weeks of launch. But competition wasn't Quake Live's only problem during its cycle. Monetization proved to be a struggle for id Software with their new title. While they definitely deserve points for trying new ideas out, those ideas proved to be unpopular at the time. The original idea on release was to fund the game through in-game and website-based ads, which is why the game ran in a web browser. In the same way ads pop up when you browse a blog site, ads would be placed on billboards and banners around maps in-game, which fits the game's theme of being an esport well, but wasn't as attractive to advertisers. As John Carmack later admitted, the in-game advertising stuff has not been big business. That's not going to be able to carry the project. By 2012, id Software launched both a premium and pro subscription model for extra features like private matches and stat tracking, which seems to have worked while it was implemented. Eventually, the browser version was dropped entirely in 2013 due to changes in how browsers handled plugins, and the game was repackaged into a standalone client, which led to the unfortunate cutting off of support for the Mac and Linux users entirely. In 2014, the game was overhauled with some controversial changes meant to appeal to new players. Loadouts in certain game modes, a continuous bunny hop setting which allowed players to bunny hop without learning the skill, and simplified item control and timing. This divided the player base quite a bit, with Quake purists not wanting any changes to be made to what they felt was the perfect multiplayer shooter, insulting, trash-talking, and blaming new players, often using their favorite label, the modern gamer, which they claimed to have a short attention span or need fast, immediate reward for playing a game. This is a trend that has continued with the small community of Quake purists, especially Quake Live purists, to this day. In 2015, id Software moved Quake Live to Steam and implemented the Steamworks API, a process which required a wipe of all player stats that players had been paying monthly or yearly premiums to track. Monetization was also changed with the removal of free-to-play and subscriptions in favor of a $10 once-off cost. According to SteamDB, this period had the highest player count ever for Quake Live on the Steam platform, at just over 6,000 concurrent players, considerably lower than the over 100,000 player accounts made in under 6 hours during the open beta just 5 years before. Despite a strong launch, Quake Live was never able to grow beyond its niche. Not because the gameplay wasn't good. In fact, it is still widely considered to be one of the best versions of Quake to ever be released. Rather, it wasn't able to grow because it wasn't the only option for an enjoyable competitive FPS game anymore. And to be honest, Quake as a franchise hadn't been since the mid-late 90s either. Most FPS players after the 90s didn't want that fast-paced and punishing gameplay that makes Quake the game that it is. But it wasn't willing to give up on Quake just yet, and in 2016, after the great success of their first addition to the reboot of the Doom franchise, Doom 2016, id Software announced their next big game, Quake Champions. This immediately brought back both hype and controversy for the franchise. While every Quake player was excited that the franchise was being revisited with its first true sequel since Quake 4, and its first true multiplayer sequel since Quake 3 Arena almost 17 years earlier, the addition of champions with different abilities, speeds, and health amounts was concerning to hardcore players who felt that it would unbalance the game. But possibly the most concerning change was the news that Quake Champions wouldn't be using id Tech 6, which is what Doom ran on. Because Quake Champions was in development before id Tech 6 was finished, and so instead Bethesda made id work on the sequel to Doom 2016, which was Doom Eternal, and had a small group of id employees work with the Russian branch of Saber Interactive. This was smelling like it would potentially be a Quake 4 situation all over again, where an outside company without the original Quake vision would harm the game's success. Quake Champions launched in closed access in April of 2017 on Bethesda's launcher with a cost of $30 USD to play, and entered early access on Steam in August of the same year. There was a heavy emphasis on the esports aspect of Quake. Doom was handling the single player side and slaying it, so Quake Champions was going to stick with what it did well: fast-paced multiplayer esports action. The Quake Pro League had some of the greatest esports that I have ever personally seen. Even with the addition of champions, for most players, it still felt like Quake. Item timing, fast movement, and weapons that you have to pick up off the map, all of that was there, but the player base for Quake Champions has dwindled a lot over the last 8 years since its release. The highest player count ever got on Steam was just over 17,000 players. Even with massive marketing budgets that went towards getting players like Dr. Disrespect and Shroud to play the game, the lack of a tutorial or any way of learning how to play an FPS title that was so fundamentally different from the slower paced and more popular games of the time led to content creators only playing the game as much as their contracts required them to, unable to understand what the game was trying to tell them to do. Aside from the lack of interest from most content creators and professional gamers, the immense amount of bugs and performance issues with the game kept players bleeding out. The game stayed in early access until 2022, at which point myself and my cousin found the game while we were bored, and since then I have played Quake 1, Quake World, which is a mod for Quake 1, and Quake Live. Quake Champions and Quake Live share a similar player count to this day, and many players love both games for their distinct focuses, with Quake Live being more popular to play in larger lobbies with game modes like Deathmatch or Clan Arena, and Quake Champions being the go-to for duels and 2v2 matches. If you decide to try play either of these games, just know you will struggle to find matches, since combined they have under 1,000 concurrent players. It is quite clear from the games that are popular today and have been for years that Quake is not the kind of game that mass audiences want to play. And looking at player counts and the available unit sale numbers for these titles, that has been the case since the early days of Quake 3. And at the time, Quake 1 was only 3 years old, which throws out the argument about the modern gamer being the problem. Again, a modern gamer being referred to by the Quake purists as a type of player that is often described as a younger audience with a short attention span who aren't able or willing to sit and learn the game for months before they have fun. Based on what I've learned making this video and compiling all the information and data I could find, Quake was simply the first 3D first-person shooter. Not the one that the majority of FPS players wanted, simply the first. And even though gamers and the FPS genre as a whole moved on from the franchise and the arena shooter genre the moment that they had a chance, it doesn't change the fact that without Quake, FPS would never have been what it is to this day, and I would never have been able to enjoy what is now possibly the greatest game franchise I've ever played. So yeah, that's why Quake became irrelevant. If you want to see how I got into Quake, watch how I got into Quake as a zoomer next. See ya!